A millionaire auctions his daughter-in-law in the bar, but a poor farmer enters and changes everything. The smoky saloon reeked of whiskey and desperation as Margaret stood on the wooden platform, her hands bound, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. Around her, wealthy ranchers and corrupt businessmen shouted their bids like vultures circling fresh carrion. Her father-in-law, Vincent Hartwell, the richest man in 3 counties, stood behind the bar with a twisted smile, counting bills with blood-stained fingers. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the cramped room. "Do I hear 500? 500 for this fine woman?" Margaret's eyes darted toward the door, praying for a miracle that seemed as distant as salvation itself. But when injustice runs this deep, would you have stayed silent, or would you have risked your life to speak for the voiceless? The heavy oak doors creaked open, and every head turned toward the silhouette framed against the dying sunset. A poor farmer stepped inside, his weathered hands trembling not from fear but from righteous fury. And in that moment of suffocating silence, one man's courage would shatter the most corrupt auction the frontier had ever witnessed. 3 days earlier, the Colorado Territory had been painted in the golden hues of autumn, and Thomas McKenna was harvesting the last of his meager corn crop. His small farm sat in a valley forgotten by prosperity, where the soil was hard and the winters merciless. Thomas worked alone, his calloused hands moving with the rhythm of a man who had learned that survival came through sweat, not luck. At 42, he had never married, never owned more than his 30 acres, and never dreamed beyond keeping his animals fed through the coming winter. The loneliness didn't bother him anymore. It had become as familiar as the morning frost on his cabin windows. He lived simply, spoke little, and helped his neighbors when their barns burned or their cattle strayed. Most folks in Millbrook respected Thomas for his quiet decency, though they pitied him for his poverty. Every evening he sat on his porch with a cup of bitter coffee, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains, wondering if this was all life had planned for him. He had no idea that in 72 hours his entire existence would be turned upside down by a single act of courage. If stories like this speak to your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next tale of frontier justice. On that same autumn evening, 15 miles away in the grand Hartwell mansion, Margaret was scrubbing blood from the marble floor of the dining room. Her husband, Robert Hartwell, had been dead for 6 months, killed in a mining accident that everybody whispered wasn't really an accident at all. Vincent Hartwell had never liked his son's choice of bride. Margaret came from a poor Irish family, worked as a seamstress, and possessed a fiery spirit that refused to bow to his wealth and influence. After Robert's death, Vincent had expected her to quietly disappear, perhaps return to her family back east. Instead, Margaret had stayed, claiming her legal right to a portion of the estate. Vincent's rage had grown like poison in his veins. He began treating her like a servant, forcing her to cook, clean, and tend to his guests without pay. When she protested, he reminded her that he controlled the sheriff, the judge, and every business owner in the county. Margaret endured the humiliation because she had nowhere else to go and no money for passage home. But Vincent Hartwell was planning something far more sinister than mere cruelty. He had discovered an old territorial law, nearly forgotten, that allowed a man to sell a widow's labor if she couldn't pay her deceased husband's debts. Margaret had no idea that her father-in-law had been fabricating those debts for months, preparing to auction her off like livestock to the highest bidder. The next morning, Thomas was feeding his chickens when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. 3 men rode into his yard, Vincent Hartwell himself, flanked by his foreman Jake Sullivan and Sheriff Morrison. Vincent sat tall in his silver-studded saddle, his black coat impeccable despite the dust of the trail. Thomas had seen the man from a distance at town gatherings, but they had never spoken. Vincent's cold blue eyes surveyed the modest farm with barely concealed disgust. "McKenna," Vincent said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "I hear you're behind on your property taxes." Thomas felt his stomach drop. It was true. The drought had ruined half his crop, and he owed the county $47 he didn't have. "Yes, sir, but I'm planning to pay after I sell my cattle next month." Vincent's smile was sharp as a blade. "Next month might be too late. The county's calling in all debts immediately. But I'm a generous man, McKenna. I'll make you an offer." Thomas waited, sensing a trap, but having no choice but to listen. "There's an event happening tomorrow night at the Broken Wheel Saloon, a special auction. If you attend and place a bid, any bid at all, I'll personally cover your tax debt and throw in $50 besides." Thomas frowned. $50 was more money than he'd seen at one time in years, but Vincent Hartwell wasn't known for random acts of charity. "What kind of auction, Mr. Hartwell?" "The kind where a smart man keeps his questions to himself and simply does as he's told. Are we agreed?" The sheriff's hand rested casually on his gun belt, making the implied threat unmistakable. Thomas nodded slowly, though a cold dread was settling in his chest. But his desperation to save his farm had just signed his name to a contract written in moral quicksand. The following evening, Thomas walked through the swinging doors of the Broken Wheel Saloon and immediately knew he had stumbled into something unholy. The usual gambling tables had been pushed aside to make room for a makeshift auction stage. 30 or 40 men crowded the smoky room, wealthy ranchers, mine owners, territorial politicians, and other men whose expensive clothes couldn't hide the cruelty in their eyes. Thomas recognized several faces from church, men who sang hymns on Sunday mornings but were now leering with anticipation at some unnamed prize. Vincent Hartwell stood behind the bar like a king presiding over his court, accepting congratulations and handshakes from men who called him a genius. Thomas found an empty spot near the back wall, his unease growing with every passing minute. The auctioneer, a thin man with a waxed mustache, climbed onto the platform and raised his arms for silence. "Gentlemen," he called out, "tonight we conduct a perfectly legal sale under Territorial Statute 847B. The woman in question owes substantial debts to the estate of Robert Hartwell, and said debts will be satisfied through a 7-year labor contract with the winning bidder." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. A woman! They were auctioning a woman! A side door opened, and Margaret was led onto the platform by 2 of Vincent's men. Her wrists were bound with rope, and her simple brown dress was torn and stained. But even in her degradation, she held her head high, her green eyes blazing with defiance. Thomas had never seen her before, but something in her bearing reminded him of his own mother, a woman who had faced hardship with dignity until the day she died. The auctioneer began calling for bids, and the amounts climbed quickly. $50, $100, $200. The men shouted their offers like they were bidding on a prize bull, their faces flushed with whiskey and lust. Thomas watched in growing horror as Margaret's fate was decided by men who saw her as nothing more than property to be owned. Would you have watched in silence, or would you have found the courage to interrupt the most powerful man in the territory? When the bidding reached $400, Thomas felt something break inside his chest. This wasn't about money or taxes or even his farm anymore. This was about the difference between right and wrong, between civilization and barbarism. He thought of his mother's voice, teaching him that a man's worth wasn't measured by his wealth, but by his willingness to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. His hand shot into the air. $500, he called out, his voice cutting through the din like a church bell. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the poor farmer in his patched work shirt and worn boots. Vincent Hartwell's face darkened like a thundercloud. "McKenna," he hissed, "you don't have $500. "No, sir, I don't," Thomas replied, stepping forward. "But I've got something worth more than money. I've got a conscience." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men laughed, others scowled. The auctioneer looked confused, unsure how to proceed. Thomas walked closer to the platform, his eyes locked on Margaret's face. He saw surprise there, and hope, and something else. A recognition that this stranger was willing to risk everything for her freedom. "This whole proceeding is illegal," Thomas announced, his voice growing stronger. "You can't sell a human being, not even under territorial law, and every man in this room knows it." Vincent's hand moved toward his gun, but the sheriff stepped forward first. "That's enough, McKenna. You're disrupting a legal proceeding. Time for you to leave." But Thomas didn't move. He looked around the room at faces he had known for years, neighbors, church members, men he had helped during difficult times. "Is this who we are?" he asked them. "Is this what our communities have become? Are we gonna sit here and watch a woman be sold like cattle while we congratulate ourselves on our Christian virtue?" His words hung in the smoky air like an accusation none of them could escape. The tension in the saloon grew thicker than winter fog. Vincent Hartwell stepped out from behind the bar, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor like the countdown to an execution. His face was twisted with rage, but his voice remained deadly calm. "You're making a mistake, farmer, a very expensive mistake." Thomas stood his ground, though he could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. "The only mistake I see here is good men allowing evil to happen because they're too afraid to speak up." Several of the bidders shifted uncomfortably. These were men who had reputations to protect, wives and daughters who would be horrified to learn what they had witnessed tonight. Vincent sensed the mood shifting and knew he had to regain control quickly. He pulled out a leather folder and held it high. "This woman owes my family $837 in legitimate debts," he declared. "Property damage, unpaid rent, cost of food and lodging. The law is clear. She works until the debt is satisfied, or someone pays it in full." He smiled coldly at Thomas. "So, unless you've got nearly $1,000 hidden in that pathetic cabin of yours, I suggest you mind your own business." Margaret spoke for the first time since entering the saloon, her voice clear and strong despite her circumstances. "Those debts are fabricated lies, and everyone in this room knows it. My husband left me provision in his will, but this man destroyed the documents and bribed the officials to ignore them." Vincent's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fury beneath. "Shut your mouth, woman, or what?" Thomas interrupted, stepping between Vincent and the platform. "You'll add assault to your list of crimes tonight, in front of all these witnesses?" The room was electric with tension. Men began looking toward the doors, realizing they might need to leave before this situation exploded into violence. Vincent's foreman and the sheriff moved closer, their hands on their weapons. Thomas was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by enemies. But sometimes a man reaches a point where surrender becomes impossible, where backing down would mean losing his soul forever. If you were standing in that room, would you have supported the farmer or kept silent to protect your own safety? Just as Vincent's hand reached for his gun, the saloon doors burst open with a thunderous crash. A figure strode through the entrance, and every man in the room froze with recognition and fear. Colonel James Crawford, the territorial military commander, stood in the doorway wearing his full-dress uniform, his saber glinting in the lamplight. Behind him marched 6 armed soldiers, their rifles held at the ready. Vincent's face went white. Crawford was one of the few men in the territory who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. The colonel's steel-gray eyes surveyed the scene with the cold precision of a man who had commanded troops in the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. "Gentlemen," Crawford's voice boomed through the silent saloon, "I received word that there was illegal human trafficking occurring on my watch. I came to see for myself." He walked slowly through the crowd, and grown men stepped back like schoolchildren caught stealing apples. His gaze fell on Margaret, still bound on the platform, and his jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "Release that woman immediately," he ordered. Vincent found his voice, though it trembled slightly. "Colonel, this is a legal proceeding under territorial statute." "Don't quote law to me, Hartwell. I helped write half those statutes, and none of them authorize the sale of human beings." Crawford turned toward Thomas, studying the farmer with interest. "And who are you, son?" "Thomas McKenna, sir. I own a small farm about 15 miles east." "And what brings you to this den of iniquity?" Thomas straightened his shoulders. "I came because I was told to, sir, but I stayed because I couldn't watch a woman be sold like livestock while decent men did nothing to stop it." Crawford nodded approvingly. "Courage is rare these days, Mr. McKenna. I respect a man who stands up for what's right, regardless of the cost." He turned back to Vincent, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "As for you, Hartwell, you have exactly 10 seconds to explain why I shouldn't arrest every man in this room for participating in human trafficking." Vincent's carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, but he wasn't finished yet. He reached into his coat and pulled out a yellow document sealed with red wax. "This is a territorial writ, signed by Judge Blackwood himself, authorizing this auction to satisfy legitimate debts. Everything here is perfectly legal, Colonel, and even you don't have authority to interfere with civil proceedings." Crawford examined the document carefully, and Thomas felt his heart sink. If the auction was truly legal, then his courage had accomplished nothing except to make powerful enemies. But sometimes the law serves justice, and sometimes justice must serve something higher than the law. Colonel Crawford finished reading the document and looked up with a grim smile. "This writ is indeed genuine, Hartwell. Judge Blackwood's signature, proper territorial seal, all very official." Vincent's confidence began to return. "Then you understand, Colonel, that your interference here is, however," Crawford continued, "there's one small problem. Judge Blackwood has been dead for 6 months. His body is buried in the cemetery behind St. Mary's Church, where I attended his funeral myself." The saloon erupted in shocked murmurs. Vincent's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally desperate cunning. "The date on this writ predates his death by— the ink on this forgery is barely dry, you fool. I can smell it from here." Crawford gestured to his soldiers, who immediately moved to surround Vincent and his men. "Forgery of territorial documents is a federal crime, punishable by 10 years in military prison. Human trafficking carries a sentence of death by hanging." Thomas watched in amazement as the most powerful man in 3 counties was reduced to a sweating, stammering criminal caught in his own web of lies. But Vincent Hartwell hadn't built his empire by surrendering easily. His hand moved toward his gun with desperate speed, but before he could clear leather, Margaret's voice rang out across the saloon. "Vincent," she called, holding up a small leather journal. "Looking for this?" Every eye in the room turned toward the platform. The journal was brown with age, its pages yellow and worn. Margaret's bindings had somehow come loose, and she held the book like a weapon aimed at Vincent's heart. "My husband's private diary," she announced. "The one you've been searching his room for every night since his death. The one that documents every bribe you paid, every life you destroyed, every law you broke to build your fortune." Vincent's face went ashen. "That's impossible. I searched everywhere. I had men tear that house apart." "Robert was smarter than you gave him credit for. He hid it in the one place he knew you'd never look, inside the family Bible, in the hollow he carved behind the book of Matthew. 20 years of your crimes, Vincent, written in your own son's hand." She opened the journal and began reading in a clear, strong voice. March 15th, 1867. Father paid Sheriff Morrison $50 to look the other way when the Hendersons family's barn burned. The Hendersons refused to sell their land for his railroad scheme, so Father decided to convince them with fire. A gasp went through the crowd. Several men who had been friendly with Vincent began backing toward the doors. Margaret continued reading. June 3rd, 1868. Father had Judge Blackwood's predecessor killed when he refused to rule in favor of the mining company. Made it look like a riding accident, but Father showed me the telegram he sent to the men who did it. Colonel Crawford's hand was now resting on his saber hilt, his face dark as a storm cloud. Keep reading, Mrs. Hartwell. October 12th, 1870. Father discovered that the Apache Peace Treaty contained mineral rights he wanted. He hired men to attack a cavalry patrol while dressed as Indians, knowing it would restart the war and void the treaty. 17 soldiers died, including Lieutenant Morrison, the sheriff's own brother. Sheriff Morrison's face went white as snow. His brother's death had haunted him for 3 years, and now he learned it was orchestrated by the man he served. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Crawford's sharp look stopped him. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each revelation. And finally, January 8th, 1874, Father's plans for disposing of me once I became inconvenient. Quote, "The woman knows too much and asks too many questions. The auction will serve 2 purposes, removing her as a threat and demonstrating to the territory that the Hartwell name is not to be crossed. If she dies in service to whatever man buys her, so much the better." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the soldiers seemed stunned by the depth of Vincent's depravity. The man had planned not just to sell Margaret, but to ensure her death in the process. Thomas felt sick to his stomach, realizing how close they had all come to participating in premeditated murder. Vincent Hartwell looked around the saloon at faces that had once shown him respect and fear, but now reflected only disgust and horror. His empire of corruption was collapsing in real time, and he knew there would be no escape from the judgment that was coming. But cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Vincent had one final card to play. He laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or sanity. "You think that book matters? You think any of this matters? I own this territory, every business, every official, every vote that counts. Colonel Crawford might arrest me tonight, but I'll be free by morning, and every person in this room will pay for crossing me." His eyes found Thomas in the crowd. "Starting with you, farmer. I'll take your land, burn your crops, and make sure you never work again in this territory. Then I'll come for your neighbors, your friends, anyone who ever showed you kindness. That's the price of heroism, McKenna. Are you prepared to pay it?" Thomas met his stare without flinching. "A man who's lived on his knees can't be threatened with death, Mr. Hartwell. I'd rather die standing for what's right than live another day bowing to what's wrong." His words seemed to spark something in the other man. The saloon had been filled with cowards and accomplices when the evening began, but witnessing true courage has a way of awakening sleeping consciences. One by one, voices began to rise from the crowd. "I'll stand with the farmer," called out Dutch Morrison, the blacksmith. "And I," added Samuel Pierce, who owned the general store. "Count me in, too," declared William Hayes, whose ranch bordered Thomas's property. Within minutes, half the men in the saloon had pledged their support to Thomas and Margaret, forming an impromptu alliance against Vincent's threats. Crawford smiled grimly as he watched the tide of public opinion shift. "Looks like your reign of terror is over, Hartwell. Sergeant Wilson, place this man under arrest for forgery, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and treason against the territorial government." As the soldiers moved to restrain him, Vincent made one last desperate play. He drew his gun with lightning speed and aimed it directly at Margaret's heart. "If I'm going down, I'm taking her with me," he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Thomas saw the gun, saw Vincent's finger moving, saw Margaret's eyes widen with terror. Without thinking, he launched himself forward, crossing the distance between them in 3 powerful strides. The gun fired just as Thomas's shoulder slammed into Vincent's chest, sending them both crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and fury. The bullet went wide, shattering a whiskey bottle behind the bar instead of finding its intended target. The 2 men rolled across the wooden floor, fighting desperately for control of the weapon. Vincent might have been older, but he fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Thomas was stronger from years of farm work, but Vincent fought dirty, clawing at his eyes and trying to bite his throat. The saloon erupted in chaos as men shouted and pushed closer to see the outcome of the struggle. Colonel Crawford ordered his soldiers to intervene, but the 2 combatants were moving too quickly and violently for anyone to get a clear shot. The gun went off again, the bullet lodging in the ceiling and raining splinters down on the crowd. Thomas managed to pin Vincent's gun hand to the floor, but Vincent used his free hand to grab a broken bottle and slash at Thomas's face. The jagged glass opened a gash across Thomas's cheek, sending blood streaming down his jaw. The pain only made him more determined. He slammed Vincent's wrist against the floor until the gun finally came loose, skittering across the planks toward the bar. Both men scrambled after it, but Vincent was closer. His fingers closed around the grip just as Thomas grabbed his ankle, pulling him back. Vincent twisted around and aimed the gun point blank at Thomas's head. "Should have minded your own business, farmer," he snarled, blood running from his split lip. "Now you die for nothing." But Margaret had climbed down from the platform during the fight, and she was now standing directly behind Vincent with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace raised above her head. "This is for your son, you monster," she said quietly, and brought the poker down with all her strength. The blow caught Vincent at the base of his skull, and he collapsed instantly, the gun falling harmless from his limp fingers. Margaret stood over his unconscious form, breathing heavily, the poker still clutched in her trembling hands. "Is he dead?" Thomas asked, pulling himself to his feet and wiping blood from his cheek. Colonel Crawford knelt beside Vincent and checked his pulse. "Unconscious, but alive. He'll live to stand trial, which is more mercy than he deserves. Crawford stood and looked around the saloon at the assembled crowd. Let this be a lesson to all of you. The frontier may be wild, but it's not lawless. Justice will be served, regardless of how much money or influence a man thinks he has. He turned to Thomas and Margaret. As for you two, you've shown more courage tonight than most people display in a lifetime. The territorial government owes you a debt of gratitude. Thomas shook his head. I don't want gratitude, Colonel. I just want to make sure Mrs. Hartwell is safe and free. Crawford nodded approvingly. She is, and she will be. Vincent Hartwell's assets will be seized pending his trial. As his son's legal widow, Mrs. Hartwell will inherit her rightful share of the estate. He paused, studying Thomas with interest. And you, Mr. McKenna, have impressed me greatly tonight. The territorial government is in need of honest men willing to stand up to corruption. I'd like to offer you a position as a federal marshal, if you're interested. Thomas looked surprised. I appreciate the offer, sir, but I'm just a farmer. I wouldn't know the first thing about being a lawman. You know the most important thing, Crawford replied. The difference between right and wrong. Everything else can be taught. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Thomas's modest cabin as he sat at his kitchen table, still processing the events of the previous night. His face bore fresh bandages where Vincent's bottle had cut him, but his eyes were clear and peaceful for the first time in years. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Margaret standing on his porch, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a wicker basket. The rope burns on her wrists were healing, but her spirit seemed completely restored. I brought you some breakfast, she said, holding up the basket. It's the least I can do for the man who saved my life. Thomas invited her in, and they sat together at his small table, sharing fresh bread, eggs, and coffee, while the morning light painted everything in shades of gold. They talked quietly about the previous night, about Vincent's arrest, about the uncertain future that lay ahead for both of them. Colonel Crawford offered me that marshal position, Thomas said eventually. I'm thinking of taking it. This valley could use some honest law enforcement. Margaret nodded. It's a dangerous job, but you've already proven you're not afraid of danger when it comes to protecting innocent people. She paused, looking out the window at his small but well-tended farm. What will you do with this place? I'm not sure yet. Maybe lease it to someone who needs a fresh start. There are plenty of folks in this territory who deserve a chance at an honest life. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then spoke carefully. Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Why did you help me last night? You didn't know me, you had nothing to gain, and everything to lose. Why risk your life for a stranger? Thomas considered the question, staring into his coffee cup as if the answer might be written in the dark liquid. My mother used to say that we're all connected, like links in a chain. When one person suffers injustice, it weakens the whole chain. When one person stands up for what's right, it makes everybody stronger. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes serious. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd walked away from that saloon knowing what was going to happen to you. Some things are more important than safety or money or even life itself. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. Your mother raised a good man, Thomas McKenna. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the future and the strange way that fate had brought them together. Finally, Margaret spoke again. Vincent's trial will probably take months. I'll have to testify, face his lawyers, relive everything that happened. It won't be easy. You won't face it alone, Thomas promised. I'll be there for every day of that trial if you need me to be. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt truly safe. I believe you will. And Thomas, when the trial is over, when Vincent is finally in prison where he belongs, I'd like to stay in this territory, start fresh, build something good from the ashes of all that evil. This valley would be lucky to have you, Thomas replied. And if you ever need anything, a friend, a neighbor, someone to talk to when the memories get too heavy, you know where to find me. 6 months later, the territorial newspaper ran a front-page story about the trial of Vincent Hartwell, who was sentenced to life in federal prison for his crimes. The article mentioned the courage of a poor farmer named Thomas McKenna and a widow named Margaret Hartwell, whose testimony had brought down one of the most corrupt men in the West. But the newspaper couldn't capture the real story, the way that one moment of moral courage had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, changing dozens of lives and inspiring an entire community to stand up for justice. Thomas did accept the marshal position, and he served with distinction for 25 years, cleaning up corruption wherever he found it. Margaret used her inheritance from the Hartwell estate to build a school for orphan children, giving dozens of young people the chance at education and hope they might never have had otherwise. And on quiet Sunday evenings, when their work was done and the valley was peaceful, Thomas and Margaret would sit on the porch of the house they eventually built together, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. They would talk about the strange night when their paths had crossed in a smoky saloon, when a desperate auction had become the foundation of a love story that would echo through generations. Their children and grandchildren would grow up hearing the tale of how their parents met, not through a dance or a church social or a family introduction, but through an act of courage that proved love is born not from comfort, but from the willingness to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. The valley still remembers their story, passed down through families like a sacred trust. Parents tell their children about the night a poor farmer walked into a den of corruption and chose justice over safety, proving that heroism isn't about wealth or status or power. It's about the simple revolutionary act of refusing to let evil triumph while you have breath in your body to oppose it. And when those children face their own moments of moral choice, when they must decide between safety and justice, between silence and courage, they remember Thomas and Margaret, and they find the strength to stand up for what's right. Would you have found that same courage in that smoky saloon, surrounded by wealth and power and corruption? Would you have risked everything to save a stranger, knowing it might cost you your life? Subscribe for more powerful stories of frontier courage like this one, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next tale about a blind preacher who walked into an Apache war camp and changed the course of history with nothing but his faith and a worn leather Bible.